After having reviewed the literature a little bit, we are now in a position to start going around the land of survey research in general and sampling techniques in particular. And as already advertised before, we will do that in terms of a number of cycles. In a very concrete and at the same time informal way, we will introduce the case study, the Belgian Health Interview Survey, which was chosen because it's so complete. Complete in the sense that many different survey aspects come together. And that allows us, with this one case study, to illustrate about everything we do. Of course, it will not be the only illustration. As I said, there will be a few other cases, small artificial cases, but that's counterbalanced by this large real case study. After that is done, we will go in future chapters, we will go through the material, but slightly more abstract, meaning that we generalize from that single case study to commons, concepts, methods that are relevant throughout the board. And after that, gently, step by step, we will make things more formal, and it will become a little bit more mathematical as we go. Not for the sake of mathematics, but so that we have the formulae when we need them, and we can also draw lessons and get conclusions from these expressions. But without further ado, let me introduce the study, the rationale of the study, the background, and then how it actually worked. Well, Belgium was within the European Union the last country who started a Belgian health interview survey, so a health interview survey, which is now mandatory as prescribed by the European Union, Eurostat, through the EHIS, it's the European Health Interview Survey. Don't take it from me, it's not true that this is an additional study. No, the EHIS is an umbrella over the national HIS study. It means that a number of things that have to be done are described in the EHIS, and it's a set of convergence rules so that gently the national surveys, well, collect information that is useful at the European level, so they all should do that reasonably uniformly, one. And two, it's important that wherever possible, if things can be done in various ways, that as many countries as possible do it in the same way. So we started in 1997, and then that wave, that database, will be the key and also the one we use for illustration. Not because it's the oldest, but in a certain sense, it's also the simplest ones. The later ones have all become a little bit more complex with a few add-ons, and I'm mentioning 2001 and 2004 also because I will use those to illustrate some of these features. There are later versions. There was one in 2008, 2013, there will be one in 2018, etc. Now, the next thing is, the survey is so interesting because of the complexity of Belgium as a country. Belgium is a federal country, and there are many around the globe, and you would think that then it's not illogical that the federal entities, and by that I mean the Länder in Germany, the states in the United States, the provinces in Canada, etc., that these entities all are represented somehow and maybe get some out of the survey, get something out, get results, get reports. So that's vaguely what we will have to take into account. But the real complex thing in Belgium is it has a double federal system, meaning the country is partitioned twice, because that's the automatic thinking that we have. It jumps to mind that, yeah, you would expect a partition, meaning that everybody, every unit is attributable to one and only one entity. It would be very difficult if you had to say somebody belongs to, in Germany, to two Länder at the same time. 60% in one, 40% in another. We don't want that. It could be done, but we want to keep things a little bit more reasonable, closer to the ground. Now, what is this partition? Well, there are three communities, and communities is defined along the language you speak, essentially, or the language of the place you speak. But it is relatively complex. So if we draw a very crude map of Belgium, then we know that in Flanders, Dutch is the official language. In Wallonia, French is the official language, except in a few towns in the southeast where German is spoken, the German community. The rest is French-speaking. And then Brussels is partly Flemish, Dutch-speaking, partly French. And people who speak neither of the two languages actually are relatively free to choose the language group you belong to. At the same time, I can go different and say, well, there is the Flemish region, there is the Brussels region, and there is the Walloon region. So actually, one of the regions is missing from the list here, and that's intentional, it's not a mistake, the Flemish region. So, if you are in Leuven or Hasselt, you are part of the Flemish region, because these towns are part of the Flemish region, and people there belong to the Flemish community. If you're in Louvain-la-Neuve or Liège, it's the other way around. You belong to the Walloon region and you belong to the French community. But now the anomalies start. The German community is a separate entity as a community, but as a region, it's part of the Walloon region. Brussels is a region of its own, but in terms of community, it's nothing of its own. Some people belong to the French community, some people belong to the Flemish community. And of course, that's complicated. You would think that language is important because, well, if you are questioning me, I would like to be addressed in my own language, right? Especially if it's one of the official languages of this country. With other languages of large immigrant populations, it's yet another matter. We should not say that should or that should not be done. It depends on the context. And sometimes if you really want response from people, you have to go to them. You have to approach them. You have to make sure you address them in a language they can understand. At the same time, if you're going to select a sample in Brussels, and you would have to subdivide the population in French-speaking and Flemish-speaking, that's actually not officially done in Brussels. People can belong to one or the other. It's a little complicated, but sometimes it's even sensitive because people will say, you are doing a language count in Brussels, and that's actually not the idea. Brussels is bilingual, full stop. Further, there is the entities, there is also the way they are governed. Of course, there is a federal government, the Belgian government. Every community has its government, and every region, except that the Flemish region and the Flemish community, which are the largest overlapping entities. That means the Flemish community is about 6 million people. The Flemish region, sorry. But the Flemish community also, it's a little more now, but the difference is 100,000 people who we could call Dutch speakers in Brussels. So there is a marginal difference between the two, and that's why their governments are united. And for areas where they need to separate, there are all sorts of political trips and ticks and trips, the other way around, tricks and tips, now we got there. Yeah, it's getting so confusing that we're not going to spend too much time on that. It's also not relevant for us because the thing is, well, one, there are all these governments, and if they sponsor, because that's what they do, if they sponsor the Belgian Health Interview Survey, they want something in return. As I said, a report, results. But at the same time, we need to come up with a workable solution so that we can actually get subsamples. And therefore, the country has been partitioned, repartitioned, like a compromise partition for the sake of the Belgian Health Interview Survey into Flanders, that's the region, Brussels, that's the region, Wallonia, but minus the German community, and then the German community. And these entities will now be the subdivision for the rest of the study. We need a name for that. We could say the compromise unities or entities between communities and region, etc., but that's unwieldy. So we will call them regions or regional entities. But no, it's not regions in the state form, it's the compromise regions that were constructed for the Belgian Health Interview Survey. Okay, And then before we go to the goals, because before we start working on a protocol and a design, it's maybe good to think, what is the estimand? What do we want to know? What do we want to know about the population and the subgroups? But who does it? Well, the Scientific Institute of Public Health has always been the kingmaker. They have actually brought the idea forward, made it happen over the decades. They got support by the National Institute of Statistics, Statistics Belgium as it's now called, which have access, of course, to a number of resources, databases and ways to get samples out of those databases, that's very important. And also, they can deal with the privacy law by going to the people with their name known, etc., because otherwise you cannot go to them. And then when the data are entered and brought forward to the Scientific Institute of Public Health or to third parties, then they are properly anonymized, they are made anonymous. Hasselt University, throughout the decades, has provided methodological support on the sampling theory. And then, before you go on, it's maybe good to take a break now from this web lecture, pause it, take a look at the website at the Institute of Public Health, and explore the material that's available on the Belgian Health Interview Survey. Several questions you might have are actually answered there. It's not just static background material like a little description and then a document you can download, yes, also, but you can go as far as doing analyses online of the data. So it's really useful to get a feel of what the data look like and what the design is and what the hustle and bustle is of the Belgian Health Interview Survey by examining that page. So do it. That said, we are now ready to look at the goals. And the goals of a health survey is the respondent's health perspective. What do I think about my own health? So, for example, if I say I don't feel well, and they bring me to the general practitioner around the corner, and then to the specialist, and to the peripheral hospital, and then to the academic hospital, another academic hospital. And with all the investigations done, takes weeks and months and costs a lot of money, they say you're perfectly healthy, and I say, yeah, that's all nice and well, but I don't feel well. It's not that there is a problem, well, maybe there is, but for our purposes, we say the objective health, the perspective of the caregiver, and the subjective health are different from each other. And that is indicating that the objective health, the caregivers, the hospitals, the doctors, the nurses, the health insurances, they have all relevant information, but it's different potentially from the subjective health for which you need to go to the respondents, which tells us that we need to do the survey on its own terms. We're not going to get the already existing information, which would be nice and is something that you need to examine before you embark on a survey. Please, a survey is always expensive. Don't do it unless you really have to, of course. So there is that. The health from the respondent's perspective. And incidentally, you will hear me say that more. The question, do you feel well, is the archetypical question. It's also a very important one and often a good predictor for many other issues. Identification of health problems, but also prevalence and distribution of health indicators. For example, blood pressure, high blood pressure, obesity, etc., social inequality, population trends, and so on. And then what domains are present in the survey. That's another thing. Sometimes we say, oh, certain information we don't have to look for because we have that elsewhere. Like we know the proportion of smokers. That's not a health outcome variable. It's a risk factor. It's a lifestyle variable. True, and we may have very good idea about that in the population, but if you're going to examine relationships, build regression models, so to speak, you need the individual level connection, coupling. So if I know that, let's say, 30% of the population smokes, and 20% says I don't feel well, or 40% says I don't feel well, I cannot examine the relationship between the two because I don't know it at the individual level. So that means always, If you're interested in an outcome in a survey, consider that the y variables. You also will need x variables, predictor variables, and they should be collected along, unless you can do that via database coupling in a reliable fashion and in a safe fashion and in a privacy-respecting fashion, but otherwise you have to collect the data along, which is why we have socioeconomic variables, income level, also educational level, lifestyle, smoking, drinking, for example, use of health services, how frequently do I go to the doctor, do I go to the dentist every year, yes or no, etc., etc. Okay, as I said, 1997 will be the key survey used in this study, in this course. But 2001 and 2004 will occasionally also pop up because it permits me to explain differences. Well, what you see here is not everything that is questioned. No, it's only a small subset. That subset that was not coherently investigated over the 3 waves. 1. And next you see that there are 3 surveys. In those waves, until now, and that may change in the future, there is a household questionnaire which contains information about the household that would be the same for everybody living in the household. And by household, we mean people living on the same address. Is everybody in a big apartment building, in a tenement building, in a condominium? Is that all the same household? No, 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 because they will be living in different apartments. But if parents, children, and one set of grandparents live under the same roof, in the same household, they're a household. Whereas if the grandparents live next doors, same street but different number, or above, same number but a different apartment number, it's a different household. Well, certain things like, do you have a toilet? How many toilets do you have? How many bathrooms do you have? What kitchen facilities do you have? And so on and so forth. What livable space area do you have? All of these things you can question once. The household income can be questioned once. And this is to avoid that if more persons from the same household would be investigated, that they all have to say the same information. They all have to give the same information. Then we have the face-to-face interview. And of course, here we already are giving away the mode by which the data are collected. Face-to-face interviewer. Now, that can still be done in various ways, and that's something that in many surveys is changing over time. Pencil and paper, where the interviewer would write down the answers, is getting more and more something from the past. Computer-assisted personal interview, or CAPI, would have the interviewer enter the data in a computer. And needless to say that in this highly technological society with a lot of devices, a myriad of variations around the theme have been constructed. And then the written questionnaire, that has to do with follow-up questions, maybe that are not so important, but that's not the main reason. The main reason is either they're easy to answer. There's no ambiguity, because if we think about health, a face-to-face interview is better. Many people like to talk about a lot of health-related issues. I got a cold, I got a flu, I got a problem with my knee, etc. And we sometimes say jokingly, especially if people get older, they're very much volunteering all the time to talk about their own health. But there may be a few issues where they really don't understand the question, because health can quickly get very technical. I'm happy to talk about it, but if the doctor asks me very complicated questions with a lot of jargon, we all know that experience, we don't know what to say because we don't know what the doctor is talking about. So this is a case where, again, people are happy to talk about it, but you may sometimes need some background information, some help, some support. Face-to-face interview is not a bad choice. But some questions like, what is your prophylactic behavior? How do you protect yourself of contracting sexually transmitted disease like HIV, AIDS? Well, I may be willing to share information, but in a more anonymous, private way. I don't want to share that information with all my brothers and sisters and parents and grandparents and neighbors around. No, because I don't want the whole city to know that. So that's where a drop-off questionnaire, which then later is collected, can be the answer. We may already feel that a written questionnaire has the disadvantage that it would not be filled so much. And it's true, general response rates with written questionnaires are usually not very good. However, if a long face-to-face interview took place, many people will be more than happy to also fill out a written questionnaire because they may be feeling that otherwise their efforts that led to 45 minutes of questions are useless, which actually is not true because we have missing data methods. But we want as many people as possible to believe, which is actually true in a different way, that more data is better. And some variables to be collected are not necessarily private or sensitive, but they're just very easy, but time-consuming, and they can also be put in the written questionnaire. So that is just a little comment, or a long comment, I have to say, on what the three household and face-to-face questionnaires really mean. There are three questionnaires, so to speak. And then there is a lot in it, but what we see here is those items or domains that were questioned once or twice, but not 3 times. Like, for example, acute infections was on the list in 2001, but only then, among the 3 waves. Traumatism, accidents, violence, dog bites, that was not on in 2004, but yes, at the other 2 times, etc. HIV/AIDS was there in 97, 2004. And in all possible combinations, you will find stuff here. And everything else that's not on this table was actually examined 3 times in a row. Okay. So, an overview of the design, and then we will look at it in detail, is regional stratification. And by regions, we now know that there are these 4 regions, Flanders, Brussels, Wallonia, minus the German community, and the German community. Now, I will not keep saying Wallonia minus the German community. I'll simply say Flanders, Brussels, Wallonia, German community. But Flanders and Wallonia are further divided into provinces. So those provinces are also part of stratification. And then it doesn't stop there. Province is further divided in, with the French word, arrondissement, Dutch arrondissement. There is canton, and that actually reminds us a bit of Switzerland. So there are many different unities. And then finally there are municipalities, current municipalities, old municipalities, as we say, or former municipalities, but I will call them towns, that's easier. And by that we mean as it was before the communities, the towns, the municipalities, not the communities, the municipalities fused into larger entities. And then we have statistical sectors, etc. So we have a lot of entities, but when it comes to 3-stage sampling, I will indicate that, well, we go finally to individuals in 3 steps. We make selection in 3 steps. One question to keep in mind. One question to find the answer in what I'm going to say later is, yeah, but provinces are regional entities. Towns are regional and provinces are geographical entities. Provinces are geographical entities. Towns are geographical entities. Why do you put one in stratification and the other one in multi-stage or 3-stage sampling? Question mark. It's a very important question. We do need to know the answer to that because there are profound implications on analysis methods, but also on the precision of the study, etc. Okay. In giant steps, what I've now circled is the design. But there are a few remarks to be made further. The German community is overrepresented. And the reason is, well, Belgium being, I will be using the number 10 million. It's actually closer to 11 million, but for rounding of figures, 10 million is easy, right? Because 10 million can easily be split in 100%, We can do a lot of simple calculations in our head from there, but know that the actual number is a little bigger. Well, the German community within that country is only something like 65,000 people. Let's make it 60,000. 0.6%, 0.6% of the population. It's very small, and either you leave them out or you overrepresent them to say something meaningful about them. It doesn't matter at the Belgian level, right? At the Belgian level, we might say, let's ignore the German community, let's not use it. Is that acceptable? Well, as we will be saying repeatedly, in a way, no. Because every unit that is not examined, every subgroup that is not examined can cause a potential bias. And sometimes groups much smaller than 60,000 would create considerable bias. If you say the most care-needing elderly people are not part of the survey, you take them out and you will make your population all of a sudden much healthier. So the question is not so much, if I leave out a group, how large is it? But how different is it from the group that's included? So leaving out is giving them probability 0. Can I do that with the German community? Well, the answer is likely yes. And from analyzing the data, because they have been collected several times now, the answer is yes. But there are two major arguments against it and a few others. One is, yeah, but the German community wants results of their own. But then I cannot leave them out because they're not there anymore. So for Belgium, not a problem. For Wallonia plus the German community, maybe not a problem. But for the German community in itself, of course, yes. That's one thing. And second, the European Union wants every region to be represented. So for whatever reasons, a federal government cannot say a certain part of our country, a geographical part, is not going to be included, even though that very small region may imply considerable cost. And why would that be? Well, because, for example, the German community is defined by a third language. Flanders, Brussels, Wallonia. Well, you can deal with those three regions by using French and Dutch. But for the German community, you all of a sudden need German. And that means translation with all the cross-translation issues, etc. It's very hard to make sure that a translation in a technical, precisely defined sociological or medical fashion has exactly the same meaning in all languages. With two languages, it's difficult enough. With a third language, you make it even more complicated. For example, we know that even from translation within the same broad linguistic community. Let me give an example between American and English. There is the word parking lot and the word car park. Now, that's a simple example because even though the English will not use car park and the Americans will not, they will use car park but not parking lot, and in America the other way around, people will understand it. A truck and a lorry is already a different matter because many Americans may say, what do you mean by a lorry? Never heard of that. Whereas most English will know the word truck. But then there are health-related problems. For example, if you say in informal speech rubber, in British English that means an eraser where you take away something from a piece of paper that was written by a pencil. In the United States, that is an informal term for a condom, for example, which in an HIV AIDS prophylactic context may well be useful in a survey. Well, every adjacent or non-adjacent languages, like Dutch from the Netherlands and Dutch from Belgium, there are examples all over. French, there is the famous or infamous word pistolet, which in Belgium and the same in Flanders and in the Netherlands means a little bread, a hard bread, a round bread that you eat for breakfast, usually on a Sunday. Whereas in France, it may be a pistol. So we have to be very careful with cross-translations, let alone from one language to the other. So it would make sense to leave them out, as I said, for those reasons, but we cannot. And especially because the German community wants results of their own, the sample size should be sufficiently large and it will be oversampled. Rather than, for example, I don't know, we don't know yet what it's going to be, but 30, 40, 50, 60 individuals, maybe a few hundred would be better. And then the next question is, yeah, but provinces, some are large, some are small. Okay, we may approach that proportionally, and we will come to the question why proportional sampling is what we are going to do. But, for example, in 2001, 4 provinces said, hey, we are having very specific health targets. We have health policies in place. We would like to assess that. And for that, the health interview survey is excellent, except that the sample size is too small. So the 4 provinces, Limburg and Antwerp in Flanders, Hainaut and Luxembourg in Wallonia, were oversampled. And the 2 printed in bold, Limburg and Luxembourg, did that again in 2004. In later waves, it was or it wasn't the case. And then a final word about the design is the year was divided into 4 quarters, with in every quarter 1/4 of the interviews planned. Of course, we can plan a lot, but whether we achieve those goals in practice, that's a different matter. So we will have to have a robust provision that allows us to deviate from the plan that we had set out, that we had brought forward. So, for example, if in the first and the third quarter, and that's exactly what happened, there are some interviews less, we can reweigh and make sure that at the end of the day, the weights correct for the imbalances in sample size. If there are a few more or quite a bit more interviews than planned, we can downweigh. If there are not enough, we can upweigh so that on average we have 25% of the sample. Why, by the way, would Q1 and Q3 be the more difficult ones to get interviews? Well, Q1 is the first one. And especially in '97, but also in later waves, even after a few years, the health interview survey has been done 5 times. But in 2018, it's a new study. So there are new people on board, etc. It takes a bit of time before the engine starts running. Q1 is usually a bit more complicated to reach the target goal. Q3, that's a different story because that contains the months July and August, where traditionally it's a little harder to reach people because they may be on holiday for 4 weeks, etc. Okay, so the regional stratification, let's look at that now. Well, as we will come to later, the overall sample size needs to be defined before we can even stratify regionally. In the part on stratification, we will talk about sample size estimation or calculation, and that leads to the overall sample size, N. The actual sample size may be a little different from that, of course, but that's something I discuss in a minute. But then the split of the 10,000 over the 3 entities, or 4 entities, or 5 entities, or who knows how many, that is sample allocation. What sample size do we allocate to each of the regions? Now, if we go back and we think about that for a moment, we may say, isn't it natural to say, okay, we have Flanders, Brussels, Wallonia, the population size, Belgium, being 10 million, and that's where rounded figures are useful, even though it's not entirely accurate. Flanders, 6 million, Brussels, 1 million, Wallonia, 3 million, and we need a sample size of 10,000. It seems very natural to split according to 6,000, 1,000, 3,000. But you saw the figures a moment ago. The actual figures are 3,500, 3,000, 3,500. And a fraction of the Walloon sample will be taken out for the German community. Okay, so both sets of numbers, both triples of numbers, sum to 10,000. And of course, there is a huge number of ways in which we can partition 10,000 into 3 pieces. We may feel, hey, the right thing to do is this, but that's not a correct statement. There's nothing wrong with that. I think many people would call it the base design, but there is also reasons why we would do this, where the sample sizes are equal or approximately equal. Later, we will call the first one that we had in mind proportional allocation, where every region, every stratum, we should say, gets a sample size proportional to the population size. The one that we put next to it is called equal, or in this case, about equal allocation. Why would we do that? Well, there are 2 dominant reasons for that. First, every region separately, as is the case here, may want a report. They may want to do something with the data they have, and then maybe, just maybe, 1,000 in Brussels would not be enough. It would not be precise enough. We would need a larger sample size. The other thing is, some people say, political reasons, Flanders and Wallonia want the same sample size. Well, even if that may be played, it's comparison that's important, because for comparison, the best is to have sample sizes that are equal. Well, first, if I calculate a contrast between Flanders and Wallonia, like is the body mass index on average in Flanders and Wallonia the same, question mark? Well, for a given total sample size, if I want to compare the regions, they better be equal in sample size. And another thing is, and I'll come to that in a moment, is not just comparison, but putting results next to each other. And I'll give you an example of that in a moment, as I said. But one final thing is, okay, it's all nice and well, regions, 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 but sometimes we want to say something about Belgium also. Is that still possible? Can we take the average of the 10,000 interviews and claim that this is a Belgian statement? No, it isn't, because Brussels would be overweighted, Flanders would be underweighted, underrepresented, but of course you can correct it and say the 3,500 Flemish people will get a weight 6 divided by 3.5, which is about 2. In Brussels, it will be 1/3. What it is divided, or what it should be divided by what it is, and in Wallonia, it's 3 divided by 3.5. So approximately, we get weights 2, 1/3, and then this one, the last one, is approximately equal to 1. Of course, in reality, we use the correct weights, not the approximate weights. So, the rationale for deviating from proportional allocation is because we want to say something about the strata, and also comparison is easier. And I owed you something about comparison. Let's just imagine that we take the proportional sample sizes. And let's imagine that a certain quantity is estimated for each of the 3 regions, and then we compare it to the WHO standard. Now just imagine its body mass index or whatever, that for Flanders we are here. For Wallonia, yes, we are here. And for Brussels, we are here. And now we claim that all 3 point estimates are larger than the WHO standard. Flanders is significantly larger. Wallonia is borderline significantly larger, but Brussels is not larger at all. If you hear that, you say, hey, wait a minute, let me listen to that again, because it seems the other way around. Well, no. If I put confidence intervals around it, I may get something like this. And it looks like an extravagant example, but think that, yes, Flanders is closest to the WHO in terms of point estimate, but it has a sample size 6 times bigger than the Flemish sample size, than the Brussels sample size. So Flanders is in sample size 6 times bigger than Brussels. So the larger point estimate for Brussels is completely annihilated by a confidence interval that's extremely wide. So yeah, Brussels, while much bigger, is not significant. Wallonia, borderline significant, and Flanders may be convincingly significant. Now, we can understand that as methodologists, as statisticians, but try and explain that to a general public, to the Minister of Public Health, you would have a pretty tall order. That's a very difficult assignment. So you can avoid that by exactly doing what we did, and that is select all sample sizes roughly equal, which explains the allocation that was given in 1997. By the way, explaining why 1997 is easy to deal with, there is just that. Well, for the time being, there will be provinces, there will be towns, we will come to that later, but already in 2001 and 2004, the numbers are a little different. Well, we just said that in Flanders, we had an oversampling, and in Wallonia, we had an oversampling twice of 2 provinces, because they wanted to say something out of their own. That increases the size of the base sample, and of course, in the weights, that will have to be down-weighted. Now, of course, the target weight is 12,000, where you can say 10,000 of those interviews are paid by the regions and the federal government. 2,050 are paid by those 4 provinces who are requesting it. And then in 2004, it became even more complicated because there was a further increase by 450, 450, and 350 respectively for the elderly sample. So the elderly stratum was oversampled now. Why? In that year, there was the European Survey on the Health in the Elderly Population. Evidently, we now have to somehow take into account that 2004 has a much older sample than 2001 and 1997. If we don't correct, it will all of a sudden look that from 2001 to 2004, the health of the population has deteriorated. It's not true. It has in the sample, because the sample is, relatively speaking, older than the previous samples. For a good reason, because now I would have a subset of elderly people in 2004 that is sufficiently large to make meaningful conclusions. But if I don't do anything about this age imbalance, I will have a picture, if I simply take averages, a picture that's not representative for the country. It would be not representative at all anymore. I would have to bring the population, I would have to reweigh the population fractions corresponding to age strata so that they reflect the population again. Weighting is often used to bring back the population proportions, even if the sample proportions are a little different. Okay. Provinces. Provinces is the next level, and here we have, and especially in 97, it's easy to explain that, we have stratified according to population size. Proportional. So this should be very clear now. In Flanders versus Brussels versus Wallonia, we have about equal sample sizes. In other words, the regional stratification is equal or about equal. The provincial stratification is proportional within those regions. So, the sample population in Antwerp is 26.7, and yes, that's very close to the population fraction, 27.7%. Limburg, 12.8 versus 13.2. The 2 columns, sample percentage and population percentage, dance together. And if you add them up, they always add up to 100%, but of course within region. It makes no sense to do that for Flanders and Brussels combined, because Flanders and Brussels have the same sample size, but a different population size. So this is comparing apples and oranges, really. Huh? You might say, well, Hainaut is the largest province because it has the largest sample percentage. No, 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 no. It has the large sample size even, true, bigger than Antwerp, but that's because Wallonia is oversampled. Huh? If you want to compare these numbers directly, you should say that the 1,300 people in Hainaut represent like 650 people only if it were a Flemish province. So that is the oversampling, and therefore we're going to downweigh the Walloon people relative to the Flemish people. Okay, well, one more word, and I go 2 pages back for that, is the obtained numbers here. These numbers are supposed to be equal to or slightly above the target. Why? Every one of the entities, Flanders, Wallonia, Brussels, etc., paid for the survey, but wanted the number of interviews that was agreed. Now, if I'm buying from you 10 apples and I pay for 10 apples and you give me 12, I will not complain. Huh? But if you give me 9, I will complain. So this is why it was important to slightly overshoot, but not too much, because the additional interviews were not paid for. I will happily accept them, but I'm not going to pay for that. If it would be an undershoot, which sometimes happens, especially 2001 was a little difficult, one is not going to like that all that much. And then we have the busy picture in 2001. Well, in 2001, we have regional stratification, Flanders, Wallonia, then the German community, and here we also have the total of Wallonia and the German community. So the idea of this slide is to be more complete in terms of the design than the previous ones, which still provided a bit of a simplification. By the way, yes, where is the German community here? It's not shown, but know that it's part of Liège. It belongs to, the German community belongs to the province of Liège, so the 1,200 people will also include 200 people from the German community, or 300. Okay, and then we have Brussels, and then we have Belgium as a whole. So in 2001, but again now, in 2017, 18, 19, 2020, we're closer to 11 million. Flanders has a population of nearly 6 million, Wallonia about 3 million, Brussels 1 million. And that's the split of those 6 million over the population, which is then represented as proportions here in this column. Okay, so everything that is to the left of the line I'm now drawing, to the left, is just describing the population. Now, from now onwards, if I move to the right, I will move into the survey. So we could say, if we want 3,500 interviews in Flanders, and we split them proportionally, we would get 969 for Antwerp, because that number is proportional to the population size, which is 27.7%. Okay, we can do the same in Wallonia. We see that Liège get 929 interviews, but 929 interviews, but 300 have to be added to that because they are responsible for the German community. So altogether, I will go to 3,510. Okay. Now, wait a minute. Didn't we say that in Wallonia there was oversampling in the elderly? No, that was 2004. But oversampling in certain provinces, yes, but that coming later. The next thing we do is we round the numbers that we just derived. So the theoretical number of people that we should include in the survey from a given province in multiples of 50. So that's playing around a little bit until it's all multiples of 50. We're as close as possible to the theoretical value, and the sum is still 3,500. So here you see an example for Flanders. Limburg, 465 becomes 450, goes down a little bit. Antwerp goes down a little bit. Oost-Vlaanderen goes up a little bit, etc. Why 50? Well, we will work in multiples of 50, i.e. an interviewer will, over the course of 1 year, do 50 interviews. Okay, why is that? Well, that has to do with the multi-stage sampling, to which we will come later. An interviewer can do that, provided he or she has the entire year to do that, one, and provided that a good number of interviews can be done within the same household. And again, that is the playground of multi-stage sampling. Good. The overspecification is what we have agreed on. Huh? Antwerp, Limburg, they are happy to pay, or they're willing to pay a bit more for those additional interviews. In NO, it's quite a large additional group. And Luxembourg, that's a very large additional group, but that's because it's a small province. It's only 7.5% of Wallonia, whereas Hainaut is 40% of Wallonia. It's almost half of the Walloon population. So, therefore, if Luxembourg really wants to make meaningful conclusions, with 1,000 additional interviews, it's about to the number that Antwerp gets with only 350 additional interviews. It is what it is. Okay, the actual numbers, as you will see, are not terribly far away, although in Wallonia in 2001 it was relatively difficult to reach the target goal. The number of groups, look at that, that varies a little bit, but for example in Antwerp, the province of Antwerp, 950 divided by, 1300 at the end of the day, divided by 50, and you will say 26 groups, split over 19 different towns. And the reason for that is that the larger towns, and in this case the city of Antwerp, will have more than one group. The allocation to towns will be done proportional to the size of the town. The larger the population size, the more likely that a town will be selected. And that goes to a point where there is a minimal size above which a town will be selected for sure. If it crosses another threshold, it will be selected maybe a second time, maybe a third time, maybe a fourth time, etc. So that is why in some provinces it stays where you are. 6 and 6 in Brabant Wallon, 6 groups spread over 6 towns. So every town that is involved has 50 interviews, nothing more. But in Luxembourg, there are only 21 towns for 25 groups, so it means that 4 of the groups are multiples. They're just added to groups already there. And in Antwerp, it comes down to 6 or 7 groups that were allocated to Antwerp, and therefore the group is also quite a bit larger. Finally, we have the rate per 1,000, and how is that calculated? Well, you look at the number of interviews versus the population size. Well, 1302 out of 1,641,000, that is a rate of 0.79 per 1,000. The average rate for 10,000 interviews would be more or less 1. A little more because we have oversampling, but it tells us that in Flanders, everywhere am I under 1 because Flanders is undersampled relative to Brussels and Wallonia. In Wallonia, it kind of gently goes around 1, except in Hainaut, where there is a noticeable increase. But look at that. In Luxembourg, there is a terribly large increase because, yeah, if you go from 250 to 1,250, you multiply the sample size with 5, and that actually shows. The German community also is grossly oversampled because otherwise we would not be able to make meaningful statements about the German community. And in Brussels, it's a factor 3. Think of that. Brussels should have a sample size of 1,000. It has a sample size of 3,000. So the rate per 1,000 is 3 times what it would be. 3 times what it would be, you divide by that, you get 1/3, and that is the Brussels regional weight. Okay, then the provincial stratification in 2004 also with the various numbers. It's like 2 pages ago for 2001, same story. So, the stratification. We have discussed most of it, so in terms of an overview, the regions, Flanders, Brussels, Wallonia, including the German community, are considered the first-level regions. The provinces are the second-level regions, which actually means that Flanders is replaced by 5 Flemish provinces. Brussels stays the way it is. Wallonia is replaced by 5 Walloon provinces, minus the German community, plus then the German community. I write it like this. So we have 5 plus 1 plus 5 plus 1 is 12 provincial entities. At that level, I don't need to know the regions anymore, because if I give you the numbers of the populations and the sample sizes for each one of those 12 provincial entities separately, you can easily add them up where necessary to come up with the Flemish quantity, with the Walloon quantity, etc. So at the end of the day, stratification is always unilateral. There's only one level. Yeah, in my thinking, I went through the regions, and from the regions to the provinces. At the end of the day, there is nothing but the provinces. Okay. I was not able to really discuss weights here with that. Sorry, I should have said, I was not able to discuss provinces without focusing also on weights. And indeed, the relationship of provinces with weights will be discussed in what follows. Then we go next to multi-stage sampling. Well, in multi-stage sampling, here I go step by step. We just said with stratification, in my mind, I start with regions, and 2 of the regions I break up in provinces. And then I say, bingo, I have 5 plus 1, 5 Flemish plus 1 Brussels, plus 5 Walloon, plus a German community. These are 12 provincial entities, that's what it is. And now, take the Flemish region, take the province of Antwerp, for example, or Limburg, or Vlaams-Brabant, and how are we now going to get to our 50 interviews? Because that's the assignment that we have made. The consideration there is, yeah, interviewers who do this job in their spare time and when respondents are available can do that over the course of a year. If we have multiple respondents from the same households, provided that the group is equal to 50 or smaller. So that's kind of the acceptable size. So we will select towns, and in towns we will go to individuals, but only via passing through households. So we systematically sample in groups of 50. And here, of course, we need to make a few comments. That is, well, systematically sampling, what is that? We haven't introduced it yet. So we take a line segment that's the size of a province. And I'll take the province of Antwerp for the time being. So we have Antwerp, and then at the beginning, and then we have the smaller towns of the province at the end. So if we need, for example, 26 groups of size 50, we need to select out of that line segment 26 towns. But one way is to make sure that we have a jump size, such that wherever we start somewhere in the beginning, we will land a certain number of times on that line segment, and this is of course not 26, but you get the idea. All jump sizes are equally large. Every time we land, we select a group. So in this case, from the first town, we would have, let's say this is Mechelen, we would have selected once, twice, 3, 4, 5 times. Mechelen once, the next town once, etc. And at the end, at the smaller towns, the last one is not selected. The one before that is selected, and the one before that is not selected, etc. This allows us to make sure that the larger cities are represented for sure. Among the group of large towns, medium-sized towns, smaller towns, we always have selection, and that would imply roughly that the more urban areas and the more rural areas are all represented in the sample. Okay, so this is systematic sampling proportional to size. Now, if I repeat that, for example, the province of Limburg, the largest town would be Hasselt. The smallest town of the province, Herstappe, is quite a bit smaller. If I really have to draw it according to size, I should actually do this and say, this is Herstappe, here, that last one. Well, the population size, and I'm going to round the figures very grossly, but the population size of Hasselt is 100,000. Herstappe, it's less than 100, but let's make it 100. So it's 1,000 times smaller. And we might say, hey, wait a minute, but you select in both cases 50 people. So isn't the selection probability grossly different? Well, no, if I go over that line segment, of course, the hit chance for Hasselt is much bigger than for Verstappen. It's 1,000 times bigger because the line segment is 1,000 times longer. If I shoot on a line segment, the larger it is, the more the chance that I will actually hit it. So, it's 1,000 times bigger. But then, if I select Hasselt, let's take a group in Hasselt, I would have 50 out of 100,000 people that I'm selecting. In Verstappen, 50 out of 100. So that is, if I'm not mistaken, 1 per 2. This is 1 per 2,000. So the selection probability of Hasselt is 1,000 times bigger. The selection probability of an individual within Hasselt, once selected, is 1,000 times smaller. So if I multiply these two probabilities, the probability of selecting Hasselt and the probability of selecting a person within Hasselt, that probability would be constant, right? Because if I just round and say the selection probability for Hasselt is 1, then that for Verstappen is 1 per 1,000. 1 times 1 per 2,000 versus 1 per 1,000 times 1 per 2 would twice be the same thing. And this is a self-weighting aspect. Yeah, the selection probability of a town is very variable. The selection probability for an individual for a town is very variable. But these two quantities are inversely proportional. So if you multiply them, it's constant. There's a constant selection probability. So this is an advantage of doing this type of systematic sampling. Mind you, what we have done here is we have decided to select a fixed number of interviews no matter the town size. And we just discussed that there is a way to make sure that the selection probabilities are not too unequal. That is what we call the absolute version of multi-stage sampling. And in the multi-stage sampling part, that absolute version will be discussed indeed, next to a relative version. And it's a good exam question. What is the difference between absolute and relative multi-stage sampling? And what are the advantages and the disadvantages? Another consideration might be, well, don't worry so much about the selection probabilities because you can rectify any error, any difference by weighting. True, but if weights are too variable, you're really going to decrease the precision beyond the point where it's no longer useful. In other words, yeah, if we have like Brussels versus Flanders, as regions, we know that the weights would be 1 over 2, or actually 2, versus 1 over 3. The tension between the weights, which is the smallest divided by the largest, or the largest divided by the smallest, is a factor 6. That's not so terribly big. But here, if we would start to talk about factors of magnitude 1,000 or more, forget it. You're really going to distort the precision. You're going to break down the precision of your survey. It will no longer be useful. And that's why the self-weighting is important. Well, in multi-stage sampling and in systematic sampling, this concept of this geographical ordering will come back, no problem. So, how was it in '97, for example? Well, in practice, Antwerp was selected 6 times, Liège and Charleroi 4 times each, Ghent 3 times, Mons and Namur twice each, so all the larger towns were represented. Some others were represented with certainty as well. That means there was one group, there could have been 2, but there was one group, but one group was for sure. Others, if Verstappen is selected, it never was of course, but if Verstappen is selected, it will mean that it has a probability of selection between 0 and 1. But Antwerp, if Antwerp is selected, for example, 6 times, it means in this case, it could have been selected 6 times or 7 times, which could be, for example, a selection probability of 6.25. Hey, did I say probability greater than 1? That's illegal. I know it is, but the way to read that is 6 groups for sure, and there is 0.25 chance of an additional group. So 6 groups for sure, 7 groups maybe, and 7 groups have probability 25%. So that 6 groups has probability 75%. That's what we mean. The moment the probability goes above 1 in this case, for example 1.1, that means 1 group for sure, and with a 10% chance there is an additional group making it 2, but 90% chance it will stay at 1 group. Okay, so this is for 2001, the range of selection. It's a bit bigger for Antwerp, for example, in 2001, because we have, in that case, oversampling, and the province of Antwerp gets a higher sample size, so therefore it also gets a higher selection probability for its towns. Antwerp could have been 7, could have been 8, nothing else, not 6, not 9. The actual selection meant 8. So it's stochastic which one of the two is going to be, as we just discussed. Mechelen got 1, but it's not a regular town because Mechelen is represented for sure within the province of Antwerp, and there it stops. Then we have Vlaams-Brabant, Flemish Brabant, where the city of Leuven was selected once, but it could have been twice. Hasselt, incidentally, was selected once, but it could have been selected twice. So Leuven and Hasselt are on exactly the same footing here. Diepenbeek is not in the list, which means it's a regular town with selection probability 0, between 0 and 1, so it's selected or it's not selected. Whereas the towns in these lists, it cannot be. They're all selected. All towns in Brussels are selected at least 1. There are 19 towns, but because Brussels gets such a large sample size relative to its population size, any one of the towns is selected, etc. Okay, then we move on to the household level. Now, what we are going to do here also is we want to make sure that households are selected in kind of a representative way. And we have to be careful with that, because with that statement, we could also take a list of households, no matter where we get it from, and randomly select purely random sampling households. That would be representative, but it might be rather variable. There is a chance that some of the households, or that the households on average have a lower or higher socioeconomic status than the population, not because of bias, but just because of sheer good luck or bad luck. It's possible that they cluster in one area of the province, or more likely, it's possible that they are found all over the provincial chart, which is why, in the first place, we group them by towns. That has been taken care of. So now we're at the level of the town, and we want a reasonable representation across town. So we could go, for example, to the National Register, which is the sample frame being used. The sample frame is the list from which we draw, and that's not equal to the population, but hopefully sufficiently close to the population. So the National Register is taken, but then you say, hey, isn't a town a good approximation to socioeconomic status, to wealth, to welfare? Well, no. There are many towns, more than you think, where in one neighborhood people are very rich and in another neighborhood people are very poor. Some of the towns in Brussels, Molenbeek, for example, has the outer neighborhoods that are extremely wealthy. There are parts of Brussels like Vorst, for example, where the same thing happens, depending on whether you're in the higher or the lower part, very different. Brussels Central, the central part of Brussels, is like that. Uccle is a different story where most people are relatively wealthy. So for that, we need to go to subdivisions. And this is where we have to deal with the reality of the Belgian system. And that is, yeah, the subdivisions are not so great. In some countries like the Netherlands, the UK, the US, you have postal codes or zip codes that are extremely refined and precise. So in the Netherlands, the zip code of the type 1200 AC It's very precise and goes to the level of the street or even a subset of the street. So with the zip code, you can have a very narrow, small geographical region. In the UK or Canada, you have, for example, 6 digits, letters and numbers that go to the same effect. In the US, you have the 5 digits hyphen 4-digit extended zip code, very precise. But we don't have that for the Belgian health interview survey, but there is still the statistical sector, and even though most people may not know that, it's a conglomerate that used to be homogeneous in the 1970s, where, in other words, the households are relatively similar. The one problem is that the 1970s is a long time ago, and there has been a lot of evolution. Some statistical sectors have gotten much bigger, some have gotten smaller, a few have been abandoned, for example, but still is the best we can do. So what you do is you list a household on a list according to statistical sector. Yeah, but there are 2 other considerations. We want to also take the age of the reference person into account. And what is the reference person? Well, people live together in a household, for example, 5 or 6 people. Let's say father, mother, and 4 children. Okay. The reference person will then typically be the father. Now that sounds a bit sexist against gender balance, etc. Fine, it's all nice and well. But it doesn't come with rights, it doesn't come with duties, it's just a pointer to the household. We have many different household sizes, same-sex partners, loosely composed households, etc. Now just take it from me, one is indicated as the reference person, and you can take the National Register, subselect all the reference persons, and you will have a household register. And then later you bring in the other members and you have an individual register again. That allows us to select households first and then individuals from a household. So we're going to take the statistical sector, the age of the reference person, as an informal indication of the household age, but what do we really mean by that? And then the size of the household. Now, creating a list with 1 variable I know, but with 3 variables, well, I could go with 2, and then I could add a 3rd axis and make it a 3-dimensional graph, but how am I going to cycle through it? Well, I'll explain it just with 2, but with 3 it's the same. What you can do is say, I start with the age of the reference person, for example, 18. All the households with the reference person age 18 come first. Then I switch to 19. And then I go by size. Let's assume that the size is 1 many times, and maybe here 2. And then 19 is actually, it's from 1 to 3, but I order them in reverse order. So that every time a household is the same in terms of these 2 characteristics, or at least very similar to the 2 characteristics. And then I also do that across statistical sector in some ordering. What I then do is every time I select a household, I actually select in this list through which I sample, I select 4 of them. So we can do systematic sampling through this list and every time select 4. Why 4? Well, I can then randomize them, go to the first household, but maybe I cannot reach it. Maybe that household is refusing participation, then I activate another household. And so I would have the first, the second, the third, and the fourth. The first one refuses, the second one is non-contactable, the third one is successful, bingo. If I cycle through all 4, and none of the 4 participates, but that's not so very likely, then I activate, as we say, a new one of those clusters, and I go on from there. Okay, so that means that I need reserve households that are similar, and I did that by selecting 4 rather than 1. But yeah, how do I go to a new household? Well, the thing is that we select twice as many households as necessary. So half of these clusters is investigated, is contacted. But if one is exhausted without success, I go to a new one and I have half of them in reserve. We know from practice, but that's just pragmatic, that it works. We don't get into trouble with this way of working. And then at the third and final level, and that's nearing the end of multi-state sampling now, we select individual respondents. Now let me go to the case where I have father, mother, child 1, child 2, child 3, and child 4. What we are deciding is the household size, no matter what it is, the household will contribute 4 at most interviews to the survey. Suppose I have a household with a father and a child. Well, then it's clear both of them are included. Father, mother, and child, all 3 of them are included. An example with 4, all of them are included. But here now I have on the right-hand side, I have 6. Father and mother are included for sure. 2 more. Well, I randomly select 2 of the children. Well, here's an issue. Whenever you do something like that, you treat some units different from other, you have to think of, hey, what is happening to the selection probability? Well, given that the household is selected, the selection probability for father and mother is 1. For the children, the selection probabilities are 1 out of 2. So these 2 children actually represent 4 children, right? And I can easily do that by inverse probability weighting. Just turn the probabilities upside down and use that as weights. Unweighted, I would have 2 parents and 2 children, and that's wrong. That's not the right composition. It's the right people in the sample, but it's the wrong composition of the household. But the weighted totals are 2 parents and children that represent 4 children altogether, so the weight is actually restored. Okay, a comment about multi-state sampling and clustering. Well, clearly, and that brings me back to another question, is why do I even subsample? Well, there may be very large households, and I'm not thinking of a father and a mother and 18 children, but you have sometimes institutional households, etc., like a retirement home. A prison is an institutional household, but some households, community-type households, can really be very large, too large to handle. Also, the more I contribute from a household, the less information I will draw. And we will get to that when we actually study multi-stage sampling or clustering in more detail. But the somewhat counterintuitive result is 1. If I draw balls from an urn independently, or I select people independently, every new person is a piece of information. If I sample from a household more and more people, they're not independent of each other. They sometimes share genetic material, they share environmental material, exposures to things, they have the same food, etc. So the problem is that every new person is somewhat repeating what the other people have already said. And one can show mathematically that the amount of information I get out of a household plateaus. From the first to the second person, I really get a lot of information. It's almost double. But from 12 to 13, I'm at a plateau. And there is an information limit. One can show that. So practically, because if the survey takes 45 minutes and you're interviewing 10 people, that's 450 minutes. Now, you count how many hours that are. That's not practically sensible. It's not feasible. But also, the information increase is a problem. So that's the clustering effect. And clustering is dependent units. It's as simple as that. Now, clustering and multi-state sampling are often used as synonyms. The only message of this slide is they're not the same. I can have clustering without multi-state sampling. Let's say I select from a household register directly, and every household selected is interviewed in full. There's an amazing amount of clustering then, but there is no multi-state sampling. I just select households, full stop. If, on the other hand, I select towns, and in every town I select a single household, and in every household I select a single individual, well, that single individual is related to nobody else in the sample and there is no clustering. It would be a bit of a silly design, but it would be 3-stage, so therefore multi-stage, but there would be no clustering. Now, in practice, you can say both of my examples, not so much the first one, but definitely the second one is artificial. So it's very, very common to see clustering and multi-stage sampling come together. But it's a bit like a couple of which you always see the partners not at all, or you see them together. It's not because you also always see it together, or you see them together, that is the same situation or the same people or the same thing. So clustering and multi-stage sampling are closely related, but they're even different categories. Multi-stage sampling is a method of sampling. Clustering is a feature, an analysis feature. It's something that the data exhibit, and yes, that is usually provoked by multi-stage sampling. Okay, good. Now, as I just said, if you take more and more people from the same household, they will contribute less and less information. Which means that 10 people that are independent of each other and 10 people from the same household will provide a different amount of uncertainty, a different standard there, a different precision, and that concept is often referred to as the design factor. In the old days, the design factor was often used as a correction to estimators, but this was at the time that both the methodology and the software to support it was very underdeveloped. Nowadays, we can do better. There is still the design factor or the design effect, and I want you to think throughout what is the effect of using stratification? Why do we do it? What is the impact on precision? You really need to make sure that throughout the course and throughout the web lectures and throughout your reading and question asking, you know what is a method, what are the versions of that method, why do we choose a method or a version of a method, for example, why do you stratify proportional or equal? And what is the reason to do it, or reasons? Often there is more than one. And what is the impact on precision and or on bias? That seems like not a lot, huh? But if you get these things out of the various methods throughout the course, you have covered most of the ground. There are many delicate, subtle issues, but what I've now just said is, what are the methods? What are versions of the methods? Why do we use them? What are advantages and disadvantages? And what is the impact on precision and on bias? Then you have learned a lot. For example, with multi-stage sampling here, the reason to do it is not the increase of precision. It will usually decrease precision, but it makes the fieldwork much easier. If I can go for all my households to the same town, and in a household I can interview more than one person, my traveling around, my fieldwork efficiency, in other words, will increase. So efficiency for a survey at the end of the day is not just statistical precision, it's also fieldwork precision, which needs to be taken into account. Okay, and then weights. Weights is a survey design feature, a survey device in its own right. But we have already talked about weights big time. Huh? Weights exist at the regional level. Why? Because we sample with unequal selection probability. There are provincial weights. But provinces were sampled proportional to their size. Yeah, almost. But you always miss a little bit. It's usually not 100% correct. The age of reference person, you can compare the age of reference person in the sample to the population. If there is a discrepancy, you bring them together again by weights. Household size the same. Quarter, I've already discussed. If in the first and the third quarters I have too few interviews, in the second and the fourth I have too many interviews, okay, don't throw away any data, reweigh until it's back to 2,500, 2,500, 2,500, 2,500. We just discussed father, mother, and the 4 children, that there is going to be a different selection probability and therefore different weights for the parents versus the children. But these are many different weights. Which one do I choose? There are ways of combining all these weighting factors into one single weight. And I've said how, weighting factors by multiplying them. It's easy to do that with standard software. And then to round it off, this first chapter, incomplete data. Well, we can have incomplete data, non-response, missingness, non-contactable, etc. at household level. A household with which no interview was realized. That's a definition, but it can take two different forms. Households explicitly refused and they could not be contacted, but these are two different things. If they never can be contacted, you even don't know whether they would refuse had they been part of the survey. At the individual level, somebody can refuse participation if the household participates. So if the father and the mother says, okay, we participate, and then the 18-year or the 16-year-old or the 15-year-old son or daughter says, but I don't participate, it's their right to do that. And especially the interviewers and the people who organize the survey cannot exercise pressure because that would become illegal. And then at the item level, I can participate in a survey and say it's all nice and well, but that particular item, I'm sorry, I think that's too private. I don't answer or I don't know. Whatever you say, honestly, I don't know. I have to leave it blank. So at a household level, roughly speaking, there is a 50% success rate. But does it mean that from the 3,000 households that you need, only 1,500 are realized? No, because there is, as we described, as we went, a replacement schedule. When a household is not participating, you go to another one in the cluster. If the cluster is exhausted, you go to another cluster, etc. But it doesn't mean that there is a 100% response. No, you realize the number of interviews that you wanted, but that's at the expense of a much larger number of interviews that you attempted but that you did not consider. Individual level non-response, so given that the household participated, is very small, typically 2% or less. Item level, of course, that varies from item to item, and it should not include routing or branching or jumping. For example, if you're talking about cancer screening, well, prostate cancer screening, you will find the question left blank for most of the women, right? And that's not because of missingness, that's because of an inapplicable question, not applicable. And that should be taken out of the equation. So calculating the response rates or the amount of missingness, etc., is a bit subtle, that the numerator but also the denominator change from question to question. So item level response really means an answer would have been possible and meaningful, but was not realized. And that depends on the question, but it fluctuates around 10%. Okay. So, and then to round off, from design to analysis. It's very commonly observed that in a survey, we use the most elaborate, complex designs with all whistles and bells, but at the end of the day, there is complete amnesia. We completely forget everything about the design and we analyze the sample as if it was a simple random sample. The answer is no. The design should be reflected in the analysis. Ideally, every design aspect, the regional and provincial stratification, the three-stage sampling, towns, households, individuals within households, all of that should be reflected into the survey. So the stratification, the multi-stage sampling and clustering, as I said, all of that should be taken into account into the analysis. And yes, weights may be induced by these guys. Stratification typically induces weights, and by taking the weights into account, I will have done a lot. There are further corrections possible, but they're not so important as we will see. With multi-stage sampling, yeah, there can be the need for weights, but there is also the clustering effect, so that intra-household correlation or intra-town correlation needs to be taken into account. And then with missingness, missingness is not a design feature, unfortunately. Missingness is a field feature, an analysis feature, but still it needs to be taken into account. And on that note, we have not just introduced the Belgian Health Interview Survey at large, we have also touched upon many of the key concepts, not all of them, but almost all of them, and we're now in a position to move into Chapter 2 on general concepts.